Welcome to the Cato Institute. Before we begin, let me ask all of you to please turn off your cell phones if you have them, since that interferes with our sound system here. My name is Ian Vásquez. I direct our Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity. Economic history is full of examples of successes, of people, of innovations and inventions of entire countries. The explanations of economic success are about as varied as the examples. Now, development economics, as a subfield of economics, which was born in the post-war period, has gone through a number of fads over the decades, and for a long time ignored the lessons of developed countries. Those fads have included an emphasis on infrastructure, on industrialization, on poverty reduction, a focus on agriculture, state-led development, lending conditioned on market reforms, the so-called Washington Consensus, and so on. Development economics has matured over the years, and I would say that most practitioners now do accept a central role for the market and reject the more naive faith in predatory governments that characterized the field in earlier years. But in Washington, it's difficult to talk about economic development without the discussion quickly devolving into a discussion about foreign aid. And that's a shame, because we know that there are a number of things, not foreign aid, which are the real determinants of economic progress. The aid discussion, it seems to me, is a great distraction away from the real determinants of growth. And it is a reflection also of the constructivist mentality that I think still holds sway in much of development economics, whereby Washington, the World Bank, or government programs are reflexively called to solve the big problems of underdevelopment. An extreme manifestation of that mentality is the current political campaign to massively increase foreign aid to poor countries in order to pull them from their so-called poverty traps. Old, discredited ideas are being brought up, ideas that have very little support, actually, among development practitioners, and canvassed in today's political capitals. There is another view, however, one that sees decentralized decision-making in the market and in politics, that views that as a superior path. More and more scholars are discovering the insights of Nobel laureate Friedrich Hayek, one of the 20th century's greatest social thinkers, as they apply to developing countries. Insights on dispersed knowledge, on subjective preferences, on the discovery process, the role of information, and so on, all make the case against planning and in favor of individual liberty and a great deal of humility. That's why I'm very pleased to have with us today Bill Easterly, who's one of the country's leading development economists, somebody who has discovered over the past several decades in his career how useful some of Hayek's thinking can be in thinking about economic development. Bill Easterly is a professor of economics at New York University, and he also works at the Africa House, which is part of New York University. He is the co-director of New York University's Development Research Institute. He's also a non-resident fellow at the Center for Global Development here in Washington, and a visiting fellow currently at the Brookings Institution. He is the author of countless academic articles and several books. One of them is The White Man's Burden. Another one is The Elusive Quest for Growth. Believe it or not, I've known Bill the early 1990s when he worked at the World Bank. And so it's my pleasure to welcome him on his journey from the World Bank to the F.A. Hayek Auditorium today. Please help me welcome Bill Easterly.
Well, good morning. I have to confess I'm a little flustered in giving this talk because I was up late last night reading Hayek, trying to really nail down once and for all what is Hayek's secret to development, because I thought Hayek is, more than anyone, would be the economist who really finally gave us this answer to the question that we've been seeking all this time for so many years, for 25 years of my career and for all the time of you. It's actually not several decades, Ian, it's just 25 years. So I was sort of up late last night reading Hayek, then I woke up early this morning, read some more Hayek. I was kind of combing through Hayek, volume after volume, desperately trying to extract every last ounce of wisdom from Hayek as to what is the secret to economic development. And I finally nailed it at about 11:15 this morning. And I put it in the presentation, put it in the PowerPoint slides, immediately emailed them to Ian, ran out to my car and started speeding towards the Cato Institute to give this talk. In fact, a little too enthusiastically speeding, because what I'm telling you is true. I was actually pulled over for speeding on the way here. And the officer kind of waited in his car for a while, presumably to check out if I was driving a stolen vehicle that was registered to Al-Qaeda. And then he came up to my window. He said, why are you going so fast? I could arrest you right here and now. And that really shook me up. And I said, well, I'm sorry, I'm kind of rushing because I have to give a talk at the Cato Institute at 12 o'clock. And he said, oh, okay, go ahead. And he let me go. So Ian, you may not have realized this, but you have friends in the U.S. Park Police that realize the central role of the Cato Institute in our society. So let's go. Let's find out what is Hayek's secret to development. Well, we badly need a secret because there's been this developing consensus in the new millennium that we don't know how to achieve development or how to achieve economic growth. And, normally I'm a very humble guy and don't celebrate my own accomplishments, but I'm kind of proud of the fact that back in 2001, I wrote a column for the Financial Times called The Failure of Development. It actually came out on July 4th, 2001, when I was still employed by the World Bank. And the World Bank was so swayed by my arguments at that time that they promoted me to a position outside of the World Bank. And then, since then, many more people have jumped on the bandwagon to say, we really don't know how to achieve development. Harberger said that we don't know which policies achieve growth. There was a big group of famous economists that got together in Barcelona to deliberate for several days and then to conclude that they didn't have a clue. Then Danny Roderick, who is always a good contrarian and a co-author of Arvind's, said that the experience of the last 2 decades has really frustrated any expectation that we had a fix on how to achieve economic growth. The World Bank is just wrapping up a multi-million-dollar research endeavor called the Spence Commission, whose conclusion is going to be that we don't know anything. And then last of all, to achieve the maximum prestige possible, I bring together, I quote the most venerated figure in all of economics, and someone I venerate very much, Nobel Prize laureate Robert Solow, in which he said, in real life, it's very hard to move the permanent growth rate, and when it happens, it's really totally mysterious how it did happen. So that's the state in which we are in today, in which we really don't know how to achieve economic growth and development. And how did we get here? Well, we've had some traumatic experiences as development economists. There was this sort of mainstream economic consensus called the Washington Consensus, that was going to generate strong growth in Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East in the 80s and 90s, which then, after the fact, became known as the lost decades in Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. There was the failure of shock therapy in the former Soviet Union, which instead of generating growth, instead generated one of the worst depressions in economic history in the former Soviet Union, as people tried to implement shock therapy to introduce free markets overnight. And then, of course, we have had some rapid growth episodes, but unfortunately, the one characteristic that has been pointed out of rapid growth episodes is they don't last. Almost all rapid growth episodes are a very brief duration and are not sustained. Miracles don't last. And this is what we've had after the fact. There's also kind of the embarrassing fact that we haven't done all that well predicting country success and failure before the fact as development economists. So I'm going back to some of the old development economists. How well did they do predicting which countries would succeed? Well, there was one prediction that there was this one country that unveiled a development program, and the World Bank economists just kind of rolled on the floor laughing out loud when they saw the development program. And they said it's inconceivable that exports will rise as much as projected. The World Bank economists looked at this. This was a World Bank mission in 1962. This is completely ridiculous. These people have lost their minds. These people were Korea in 1962, whose growth exceeded all of the projections that were in that document the World Bank was laughing at. Then we had other people elsewhere. We had prominent economists worrying about population growth in one country that was going to be a potentially explosive problem leading to a mounting unemployment burden. That was that big disaster that is known as Singapore, and the prediction was from Nobel laureate Gunnar Myrdal in 1968. But there was at least one success story that the World Bank correctly called a country that had made remarkable economic progress, whose long-run potential compares favorably with that of all other countries in Southeast Asia. That was the World Bank on Burma in 1958. So, and then, of course, we've been surprised by success. In several ways. As I already mentioned, rapid growth didn't last, so the stars of the 60s and 70s were actually not China and India. They were Brazil and Cote d'Ivoire, who have done much worse since the 60s and 70s. China and India did poorly in the 60s and 70s comparatively, and have done great since, as you all know. Then there is one group of really consistent great growth performers, which are the East Asian miracles. The World Bank wrote a big report in 1993 called the East Asian Miracle that celebrated the success of 8 countries. Then, of course, all of them are all very well-known examples of rapid growth to you. The only embarrassing thing about that is that no one has, either then or before then, has succeeded in replicating the East Asian Miracle anywhere else. If it were so obvious how the East Asia miracle happened, then you would think it would be able to be replicated in, Democratic Republic of the Congo or some random country that was trying to achieve rapid growth. But economists totally failed to replicate the East Asian miracles anywhere else. And what's more, the East Asian miracles even failed to replicate their own success after their success had been celebrated in the World Bank report. Sure enough, after the World Bank report came out in 1993, since then, the East Asian miracles have regressed strongly to the world mean, where now they're just barely growing above the world average. So I guess the lesson of the last 2 slides is whenever the World Bank issues a report celebrating a country's success, you should immediately go short on that country, and the country itself should try to persuade the World Bank not to issue any reports on its success. So Hayek, now here is my first quote from Hayek, the first of several that will be in this presentation. Hayek actually predicted that growth would be unpredictable. And he predicted that economists would fail to predict which policies created growth. This was back in an article written in 1968 in which he predicted unpredictability. So Hayek knew something that the rest of us didn't at that time. He said, "It seems incredible to me that we can determine in advance the future structure of a society in which the major problem is still to find out what kinds of material and human productive forces are present, or that we should be in a position in such a country to predict the particular consequences of a given measure." So that was Hayek. He got it exactly right, that everything would be unpredictable. Why is everything so unpredictable? One reason is that this unpredictability happens at every level. It's not only unpredictable which countries will succeed. Within each country, it's unpredictable which industries will succeed. Who would have predicted that India, the big success story in India, which has a great scarcity of skilled labor, would be the skill-intensive IT sector, that would be the big hit? Or that garments would be the big hit in Bangladesh? Or that integrated circuits would be the big hit in Philippines, which has taken over 71% of the world market? Or that cut flowers from Kenya would take over 40% of the European market in cut flowers? Nobody predicted these things. These things are completely unpredictable. Or my favorite one, that Egypt found a big hit and which actually earns it. This one product exported to one country earns Egypt 30% of its manufacturing export revenues, and that is bathroom ceramics exported to Italy. So this was a surprise. It's not really something that lends itself to a recipe. I don't think anyone has run around saying, "Oh, thank God Egypt has shown us the way. The secret is export bathroom ceramics to Italy, and then you will become rich." What's really going on is this phenomenon that there are always big hits. The top 3 manufacturing goods out of 3,000 possible 6-digit categories of manufacturing goods in every country on average account for about 1/3 of all manufacturing export revenues. And the top-ranked export of a country among manufacturing exports produces 17 times more value than the 10th-ranked manufacturing export. So there's this incredible concentration of big hits that are of enormous scale. They're huge successes, and yet nobody can predict where they will emerge, when they will emerge, what they will be when they emerge. All we know is that they make some entrepreneurs extremely rich. With the latest Forbes 400, the latest Forbes list of billionaires, we've seen some remarkable billionaires emerge from poor countries. There's a Nigerian who's worth $3.3 billion. There's the number 3rd-ranked billionaire in the entire world is an Indian named Lakshmi Mittal, who's made $45 billion from producing steel better than anyone else in the world. So not only the what is unpredictable, the who is unpredictable, the where is unpredictable, and the when is unpredictable. So let's call on Hayek again to explain all this to us. What is the system that is best equipped to cope with this enormous unpredictability? Well, it's free market competition. Hayek said free market competition is important primarily as a discovery procedure whereby entrepreneurs constantly search for unexploited opportunities that can also be taken advantage of by others. This again is Hayek in 1968. He understood this enormous unpredictability was itself the best argument possible for free market competition, that is the system that leads to this decentralized search for big hits that lead to huge returns. And in case you think that Hayek was talking about rich countries, Hayek in the next sentence said, this is true to an even greater extent in underdeveloped societies. And then a more colloquial way to say this, I think, was given by this unsuspected economist that you may not know about, named a screenwriter named William Goldman, who's written many Hollywood hit screenplays himself. He wrote a book about his life as a screenwriter called Adventures in the Screen Trade, and he sort of gave the Hayekian view of Hollywood. But he put it a little bit more bluntly. Nobody knows anything. Why did Paramount say yes to Raiders of the Lost Ark? Because nobody knows anything. Why did all the other studios say no? Because nobody knows anything. Why did Universal, the mightiest studio of all, pass on Star Wars and thus forever lose the opportunity to star Natalie Portman? Because nobody, not now, not ever, knows the least goddamn thing about what is or isn't going to work at the box office. Am I allowed to say goddamn at the Cato Institute? Thank you. Lowercase, thank you. I don't know if you have like a 2-second delay on the microphone here with a bleep, but. So, despite the lack of knowledge about how to achieve developments, there are all these poor people that have the nerve to achieve development anyway, in spite of the lack of our expert advice to them. Over the past 50 years, far from there being a poverty trap, there was parallel growth, on average, of rich and poor countries. There's no systematic difference on average if you measure who is rich and who is poor at the beginning of each period over the last 50 years between the rich and the poor countries. They've both grown at about 2% per capita on average. 2% per capita is not the greatest growth rate of all time, but it's unprecedented in human history that the whole world would be growing at 2% per capita, and that was enough to just fuel the greatest mass escape from poverty in human history, which has happened in my lifetime. I'm 50 years old, and so over the past 50 years, I'm not taking personal credit for this, but over the past 50 years, we've had the greatest mass escape from poverty in human history. Now, was this due to the genius of foreign aid? Well, let's just look at the numbers. Even if everything I ever said, everything negative that I've ever said about foreign aid was completely wrong, and we took the most optimistic view of foreign aid, that every dollar of foreign aid reaches a poor person and increases the income of the poor person 1 for 1, would foreign aid even then have been the explanation for the greatest mass escape from poverty in human history? Let's look at the numbers. Today, foreign aid is $100 billion per year. How much income are poor citizens of poor countries producing for themselves every year? They're producing exactly $24,798 billion every year. So, in case you're not getting the point, the number on the right is a lot bigger than the number on the left. A lot bigger. So, we're talking about homegrown success that people have created for themselves. Poor citizens have created more income for themselves, to lift themselves out of poverty, to now reach $25 trillion in GDP for the poor world. And while we're talking about individual freedom, this is just kind of a throwaway slide, but I want to remind you that another big factor in the greatest mass escape from poverty in world history that we've seen in our generation have been the remarkable inventions and the diffusion of inventions, where both the invention and the diffusion are largely due to individual creativity and not to, and diffusion meaning you need to do a lot of adapting to take an invention made in one place and adapt it to another place. And all of this is a story of individual creativity. This is not, none of these things here were invented by a government committee or an international Millennium Development Goals task force. These were things that were stumbled upon by first some individual who discovered a technological breakthrough, and then other individuals discovered further technological breakthroughs to make all of these inventions change our lives radically. And that's the story of technology that has supported the great escape from poverty, culminating, of course, in the greatest invention of them all, which I have pictured in the upper right, the iPod. So now we're finally ready. How to achieve development. We're finally at the point where I can tell you Hayek's secret. Hayek did come up with a secret to development, and I'm going to give it to you. I was supposed to have a drum roll operate at this point, but it looks like it's not working. Let me see if I can click on this. No, the drum roll technology didn't work. So just imagine a drum roll here. You ready for the answer? You've been waiting 50 years. That's all the enthusiasm you can show when you're about to learn the secret to economic development. You've been waiting 50 years, and now it's coming. Okay, you ready? Here's Hayek's secret. There never has been a secret to development. There's not now a secret to development. There never will be a secret to development. The secret to development, which takes a lot of intellectual courage to discover this secret, the secret to development is that there is no secret. Hayek put it in a much more eloquent way, so I'm going to... Hayek explained that the fact that there is no secret is itself the strongest argument possible for individual liberty. And here's Hayek's secret. He said, if there were omniscient men, he said this way back in 1960, if only people had listened to him rather than dismissing him as a crank for many years. You know, I was, when I got my PhD in the early 80s in Cambridge, Massachusetts, you know, you could not, as an economist, you could not admit openly to admiring Friedrich Hayek in Cambridge, Massachusetts. That would be, you know, a huge source of scandal and shame. You know, I would, you know, if I admitted to, in that time, admiring Friedrich Hayek, I would have had to have sort of like one of those standard scandal news conferences, you know, where my glum-looking wife would be standing by my side. And I would say, you know, I'm sorry, I've betrayed my sacred trust to the economics profession and my family. And I want to begin the healing process. I've, you know, been in love with the ideas of Friedrich Hayek, and I just wanted to get that out in the open now. So here's Hayek's secret. If there were omniscient men, if we could know not only all our present wishes, but also all our future wants and desires, there would be little case for liberty. And in turn, liberty of the individual would make complete foresight impossible. It's liberty that has made for all this tremendous unpredictability that I was talking about earlier. It's the fact that free individuals, you cannot predict what they will do next. Liberty is essential to leave room for the unforeseeable and unpredictable. We want it because we have learned to expect from it the opportunity of realizing many of our aims. It is because every individual knows so little, and because we rarely know which of us knows best, that we trust the independent and competitive efforts of many to induce the emergence of what we shall want when we see it. That is, in one sentence, the secret to economic development. Liberty to make possible the unforeseeable, unpredictable, through the independent and competitive efforts of many, so that we have the completely spontaneous emergence of what we shall definitely want when we see it. And so here we see the emergence of what we want from freedom. The more, this is a measure of economic freedom. The more economic freedom there is, the more people get, the richer they are, and the more they get in the way of material possessions, in the way of, you know, computers and iPods and cars and all those things that I showed you before. Here's a measure of political freedom. Political freedom measured on the horizontal axis, and again, per capita affluence measured on the vertical axis. So here's the emergence of what we want from political freedom. Now, let me caution you right away about what conclusion not to draw from this graph. Here is, if you think that this is the answer, then you still have not quite gotten Hayek's point. If you think that the answer was, well, oh, we know the answer, just immediately implement democratic capitalism and poor societies will become rich. That's not the answer. That's still not the answer. Because there's no one in a position to implement democratic capitalism. There's no one who can be put in charge to implement democratic capitalism. That's a contradiction in terms. And here Hayek explains the process some more. So here's, the fruit of all my late night reading of Hayek is all these quotes I pasted in here. This is kind of a standard lazy way to give a speech. It's rather than come up with your own material, you just quote someone else who understands things better than you do. So here's another great quote from Hayek. The interaction of individuals possessing different views is what constitutes the life of thought. The growth of reason is based on the existence of such differences. Its results cannot be predicted. Here again, he's harping on this stuff that cannot be predicted. But we've seen that's a great thing to harp on, because if there's anything else about growth and development, it's that it's completely unpredictable. That we cannot know which views will assist this growth and which will not. To plan or organize progress is a contradiction in terms. I wish that could be put on the wall of the World Bank, where right beneath the slogan where they say our dream is a world free of poverty. Well, they have no clue how to achieve that. So I'd like to put beneath it, to plan or organize progress is a contradiction in terms. Take that, Millennium Development Goals. Pow. Individualism, individual liberty. Individual liberty is an attitude of humility before this social process, this spontaneous social process, and of tolerance to other opinions, and is the exact opposite of that intellectual hubris which demands comprehensive direction of the social process. This is exactly where development has gone wrong for 50 years, is that we demand comprehensive direction of the social process. And that demand leads to undevelopment. It leads to lack of development. It leads to underdevelopment. Hayek's insight was giving up on that demand for direction of the social process is what leads to liberty and development. So how do you create the conditions for individual freedom? How do you individual freedom seems to be, the big thing going on here. So how do you create the conditions for individual freedom? That's, there's sort of an infinite regress here. You say individual freedom is what matters, but then how do you create individual freedom? So the conventional answer, which again completely fails to understand Hayek's insight, is the conventional answer is get together a bunch of experts on institutions, assemble all the world's leading experts on institutions that promote economic freedom, and have them design the right institutions for economic freedom, and then have those implemented by tomorrow. That's the conventional answer. Here's Hayek's answer. The value of freedom consists mainly in the opportunity for the growth of the undesigned. And the beneficial functioning of a free society rests largely on the existence of such freely grown institutions. So Hayek is saying, no, you still don't get it. You can't put the experts in charge of designing the institutions that promote freedom if the institutions themselves emerge from freedom. It's the institutions themselves emerge spontaneously from free individuals. That's the growth of the undesigned. No one's designing institutions. The beneficial functioning of a free society rests largely on the existence of such freely grown institutions. I know I'm really stretching the paradox here to the utmost. There has certainly been no successful attempt to operate a free society without a genuine reverence for grown institutions. So the opposite of freedom is you try to do top-down social engineering to try to make the right institutions. The meaning of freedom is that you allow out of free individuals institutions to grow to accommodate that freedom. Now, this may sound really hopeless. How is freedom just going to spontaneously grow from free individuals? How is it going to emerge? How are we going to get these? This just drives people crazy when you say things like this, that it's the growth of the undesigned. It's freely grown institutions. Well, I don't know. I'm sorry if this paradox kind of disappoints all of you and me who made our careers as kind of social engineers of institutions, but the good news is that freedom is actually spreading around the world. There's something happening here, to quote the line of an old, really smarmy, sentimental rock song that I play that my kids cringe at. Something is happening here, and the something happening here is freedom is spreading around the world. Here's two graphs, one on economic freedom and one on political freedom. Very, very subtly depicted in the colors of red, white, and blue. The red is the not free, the white is the partly free, and the blue is the free. Where, of course, these are based on measures which are imperfect, and the definitions of not free and free are very imperfect, so we're dealing with imperfect measures here, but they do give us some idea of what is going on around the world. And this is, the share of countries around the world that fall into these three categories. Economic freedom has been growing at the expense of economic unfreedom. Political freedom has been growing at the expense of political unfreedom, at the expense of political oppression and repression and violation of human rights and oppression of the individual. Freedom has been growing. So it's happening. Freely grown institutions are happening. So let's keep pushing this paradox to the utmost. That the key to understanding freedom is to not say freedom is itself the secret. I'm still going to stick to the principle that the secret to development is that there is no secret. Freedom is not the secret. It is the recognition there is no secret. And it's the willingness to acquiesce in a spontaneous order in which there is freedom for individuals. So any expert recommending some comprehensive reorganization of a society, even if he recommends it or she recommends it in the name of freedom, even if they call it free market reforms, a package of top-down free market reforms designed by free market experts at the World Bank and the IMF, of which I used to be one. That whole idea is violating freedom. Freedom emerges from the bottom up. There's some freedom initially of individuals, and free individuals act in a way that leads to more freedom. Economic and political freedoms feed on each other. The success of individual business and technological entrepreneurs generates demand for more individual freedom to accommodate and exploit the success that individual business and technological entrepreneurs have created. So people have got it just backwards. They think we need to come in, our social engineers first need to come in and create the institutions for freedom, and then you can have individual business and technological entrepreneurs operate freely. Well, people completely forget that the more powerful direction is the other way around. That individual business and technological entrepreneurs discover great successes, and that creates the demand for more freedom and leads to spreading support for more individual freedom. And then individual political and social entrepreneurs come up with novel, incremental solutions to get more freedom. And so that's the process that Hayek was talking about, by which free institutions are not made. They are not made by human hands. They are grown spontaneously out of the interaction of many free individuals, out of many entrepreneurs in the business, political, and social worlds. But I know this makes you very unhappy, because all of us sitting in this room want to do something to help poor people. I'm almost done. This is the conclusion. So All of you want an answer to this question. What do you do? What do we do if we want to help make poor people richer? Well, I have several suggestions that I think are constructive, even in a world where the secret is that there is no secret. First, take advantage of the power of ideas. The idea of individual freedom is itself a great intellectual entrepreneurial innovation has just barely begun to catch on in the world today. So use the power of ideas to spread the idea of individual freedom. Why individual freedom is the only thing that works to accommodate the enormous unpredictability of development. To give its intuition, to stress the historical record that where freedom has grown, poverty has ended. That freedom has tremendous force to end poverty. Second, to oppose ideas that seek collective expert direction of development. Not to mention anything in specifically, but basically any effort by the United Nations, IMF, or World Bank, any effort known by something called the Millennium Development Goals, or anything like that. Oppose ideas that seek collective expert direction of development. Actually, there's a great new book that has just come out today called Commonwealth. The title of the book is Commonwealth, and it's Ideas for Solving All of the World's Problems by that great fan of Friedrich Hayek named, the name is escaping me, Jeffrey Sachs. If you want to know how not to achieve freedom and development, then read this new book that has come out today, Commonwealth, on how to implement collective expert direction of development in a way that is guaranteed to lead to underdevelopment. And lastly, yourself. Be a business, political, or social entrepreneur to discover very specific breakthroughs that will help the poor. You all have the potential. I have the potential. All of us have the potential to be those entrepreneurs that discover great breakthroughs like those that I've already mentioned, either in the private sector or in the public sector, that will achieve a lot of good for poor people. So what was Hayek's answer? Hayek's answer, he refused to answer the question, what is the secret to development? Because it had no answer. He wouldn't answer the what. He refused to answer the question, which societies will find the secret to development? Because it's impossible to predict. But he did have an answer to one question, which is, he did agree to answer the question, who is the secret to development? Who is the secret to development? Have you guessed the answer by now? The answer to the question to who is the secret to development, the answer is each of you, free individuals, seeking another powerful thing such that the rest of us will want it when we see it. So the answer to the question is who is the secret to development? Who is the secret to development? The answer is you. You are the secret to development. So, if you need a little bit more inspiration to survive in the brave new world where everything is unpredictable and only individual liberty works to achieve development, I'll close with my favorite phrase of political oratory of all time, which is Lincoln's. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that we here highly resolve, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, that we here highly resolve that our world shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth.
Thanks, Bill. I think those were hopeful comments, even though you didn't give us a detailed direction on how to get development. But that's why we also have invited Arvind Subramanian here. Arvind has for many years worked at the IMF, most recently, before leaving the IMF, as assistant director in the research department, which has done really in recent years tremendous work on the issue of economic development, stressing importantly economic freedom, and that is of course a big component of individual liberty. He is now a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. He's also a fellow at the Center for Global Development here in Washington, D.C., and he has also served for GATT, the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, in the past. So he has a wide experience with multilateral institutions and economic development generally. Please help me welcome Arvind Subramanian.
Thanks a lot, Ian, for inviting me here. I was going to say it's always a pleasure to come, but as the first time I'm coming here, so it's a pleasure to be here. If I can find my... do you know where I should go to the desktop, or do you know how I should find it?
I don't know. What, can you have... Oh, in the desktop, okay.
Oh, it's on the desktop?
We have to search for it. Yes, it's on the desktop.
Actually, let's just go there then. Okay, then.
Yeah, sure. You want to find it then?
Okay, let's go. It's always a really difficult act to follow Bill. You know, there's Bill the economist to cope with. There's Bill the orator, and now Bill the the great speaker and peddler of freedom, if I may say so, to contend with. And of course, I didn't have Bill's presentation. And unlike the erudite Bill, I didn't go and read up Hayek. I just went to Wikipedia to get some Hayek quotes. And just to ensure that I had some measure of respectability in terms of knowing about Hayek, I went and read a very nice piece in the New Yorker by Jim Cassidy on Hayek. So my knowledge of Hayek is fairly limited, apart from what I know, what I've picked up over the years. Now, I know this is the Cato Institute, and this is an event on Hayek, and we have just heard Bill. But I don't think I'm going to let that stop me from challenging, endorsing some, but also challenging some pretty important things that either Hayek has said or Bill has said on his behalf. So hopefully, we'll have an interesting discussion so that there's some kind of back and forth here. So the way I think about Hayek, at least the two big ideas of his through which I think one can view development or the development experience is that, this is the thing about, I should have added, economic and political decentralization, the magic of markets, the power to assimilate information, the screw-ups associated with centralized planning, which Bill has suggested. And the second idea is the idea of the fatal conceit. And I want to break it up into two bits, because I think a lot of what Bill says, I think, conflates two very different issues. One is, the fatal conceit of outsiders, and the other is a more questionable, or at least certainly more open to discussion, is do insiders also suffer from a fatal conceit necessarily? And I'm going to argue that what Bill has said actually is kind of a false opposition, and there is a serious question about the question of the fatal conceit of insiders, because the opposite of let freedom rule, let people decide, is not planners sitting on 19th Street directing development. I mean, the real world is about, within capitals, within countries, you have policymakers, and they have choices to make, decisions to take, and the question is, what should they do? And we know, as Bill rightly said, that although centralized planning from Washington and New York has failed, we know that policymakers have made a number of successful choices, which is why development has succeeded around the world. So we can't ultimately get away from the question of, the so-called fatal conceit of policymakers within countries. So what does Hayek have to say about these things, and what does the development experience have to say about things? I mean, the easy bit is for me, and I'm going to begin with the fatal conceit of outsiders, is the whole notion of planning from outside. And here, I am 100% with Bill. This is a graph from a chart from a paper that I did with Raghu on aid and growth, which got us into a lot of trouble, which basically tends to suggest that, countries that receive more aid, if anything, grow slower on average. So I think a lot of credit to Bill for having, debunking this idea. And just to quote again his favorite economist and my favorite economist, Robert Solos once said that the job of economists is to consign bad ideas to the dustbin, because there are no good ideas in economics, but at least the job is to consign bad ideas to the dustbin. And here I think Bill is doing a great job of at least consigning one of these ideas to the dustbin. Now, we have various versions of this, fatal conceit of outsiders being able to direct or determine development. And I recall here once, Galbraith once, they were having this discussion on foreign aid, and he kind of said, no, aid is very useful. It can be helpful, provided a set of prerequisites are met. And he listed, the usual 25 list of things, to which Albert Hirschman replied, if we could meet these conditions, the country wouldn't need aid in the first place. So foreign aid and the outsider conceit, I think Bill is absolutely right on that. But what about the other central insight of Hayek, and which Bill has spoken very eloquently about, economic and political decentralization? I think, I'm going to argue that it's only half right, or at least incomplete, or at least not completely consistent with the evidence, and that there are lots of interesting questions here which don't necessarily follow from or are consistent with the Hayek view of the world. I think it's broadly right because, on average, it is true, as Bill said, in the last 25, 30 years, we've seen huge increases in growth, huge reductions in poverty, and surely a lot of that has to do with this move towards economic decentralization that Bill spoke about. But I think the way I see it, there is a really deep puzzle lurking in the background of development experience, which is that it is not the case that countries that have reformed the most, i.e. that have undertaken the most economic and political decentralization, are the countries that have done better. Let me show you a few charts. The IMF now is compiling these very nice indicators of reform, how much market reform has taken place around the world. And I'll just show you one chart, but I think the picture is generally true. This is, for example, how messed up are banking sectors within countries. And no matter what kinds of charts of these type you see, two things stand out. That whether you take the current level of how messed up countries are, or how much change there has been over time in terms of undertaking market reforms, you will find that Africa and Latin America do much better than many other countries. I.e., between, let's say, 70 and 80 and now, Africa and Latin America have reformed the most, and on most indicators in terms of how open they are, they're actually much more open than many of the so-called messed up countries. Now, but of course, the performance has been very different. The star performers in the world over the last 25 years, and even going back over 40 years, are, in the first period, as Bill mentioned, East Asia, but in the last 20 to 25 years, it's China, India, and Vietnam. And Latin America, which did so well between 16 and 80, after 20 years of reforms, not only is doing much worse than China, India, and Vietnam, it's also doing much worse relative to its own past before 1980. So I don't think we can get away from this deep puzzle about the development experience of the last 25 years. China, Vietnam, and India, as I've said, have done much better than the ones that have either reformed more or are more open, i.e., in the sense of Hayek. Just to give you an example, India, there's been very little privatization. The public sector dominates the banking system. It's more closed to trade and foreign capital than almost any country that you can think of. It has a highly overregulated labor market. And yet in the last 25 years, it's grown amongst the fastest in the world. And in the last 4 or 5 years, has really grown very rapidly. And same is true for China. It's a messed up system. It's still a socialist system. And a point that Danny Roderick makes, I think, is quite compelling, that if in fact China, India, and Vietnam, and countries like that had been doing worse than they are, and doing worse than Latin America and Africa, I mean, this would be a kind of home run for the Hayekian view of the world. More economic decentralization, the faster the growth. But that's not what the data shows you. So this is, I think, a deep puzzle about the contemporary development experience. Now, let me just add that I've been speaking about economic decentralization, but if anything, it's even more true of political decentralization and the development experience. Let me say first of all that democracy, etc., have intrinsic value. So I'm not saying that choices about these things, insofar as there are choices, should be made just on the basis of whether these things get you more growth and more poverty reduction, etc. But leaving aside the intrinsic value of these things, I mean, if you were to ask, is there a connection between political decentralization and economic performance, I think you would find a very, very mixed picture. So here are two, I think, striking facts. The only 2 countries in Africa that have grown sustainably over the last 40 years, the only 2 countries are Botswana and Mauritius. And what is common to them? They are the only 2 countries in Africa that have been sustained and uninterrupted democracy since independence. So this would be like, strike one for von Hayek and Bill. But the problem is, you look around East Asia, the model very much has been lack of political decentralization for long, long periods, rapid growth. You think of the East Asian countries, and then eventually political decentralization catches up with economic decentralization, as in Korea, Thailand, Indonesia, or it doesn't catch up at all, as in kind of Singapore, for example, and China. So to say that political decentralization is the answer to economic development is certainly not consistent with the data, and it's difficult to make a case for these things just on the basis that these will deliver economic development. I don't think that's borne out by the data. So how does one understand this puzzle? And the way I think about it is the following, that there's no question that, markets are important to create the opportunities, the incentives for the private sector. But, I mean, if what I said is just right, that's not enough, because certainly the countries that have done more in this direction are not the countries that on average have grown faster. Then there's something else going on here. And that, economic decentralization is important, but it's not, at least over these periods that we've studied, not decisive in terms of generating a long-run growth. So the way I think of it is that, there is a black box out there which we don't fully understand, and it's that interaction between this black box and the opportunities created by markets and economic decentralization that delivers on economic development. What this black box is, I completely agree with Bill and von Hayek. I mean, we don't really know, because certainly the experience has been very, very heterogeneous in the last 25, 30 years. In the case of India, for example, the skills that are the skills-based IT revolution that everyone celebrates now was created completely. It was historically created by the government and under unusual circumstances, and it just happens to be a matter of luck today that India turned out to have these skills in order to exploit the opportunities created by the IT revolution. And of course, in the case of China, in the case of China, I mean, dare we say it? I mean, some of the capabilities that China has had to create the growth have been created by have been a creation of communism. So I'm not saying, therefore, that communism is the recipe or is important to create the capabilities, but it's something that we just don't understand. But the essential point is that just economic decentralization is not delivering all the goodies that we want out of an economic system. So I think it's clear that we do have a robust understanding of the negative agenda, what not to do. It's easy to say, don't be a Zimbabwe, don't debase the currency, don't create hyperinflation, don't expropriate wealth, and some basic don'ts we have a good sense of. But beyond that, I think there are at least two kinds of uncertainties which are very much consistent with the Hayekian notion of the fatal conceit. Kierkegaard said that life is lived forward but understood backwards. But I think in the case of development, both the retrospective understanding is riddled with uncertainties, and even more so about the prospective, policy agenda for what to do to get some of these things that deliver economic development. I don't want to go through the uncertainty on the retrospective understanding, because I think Bill himself has written eloquently. In fact, his first book, The Elusive Quest for Growth, actually goes through some of these so-called magic bullets, mantras, which never delivered. And so there's a lot of, we genuinely don't know because we thought education would be good, but it didn't deliver. We thought health would be good. We know that health doesn't necessarily deliver development. And of course, the autocracy, democracy question, as I just said, is still completely open in terms of at least a growth over 20, 30, 40 years time spans. I was going to show you two clips. I don't know whether it's going to work. Because now we talk about institutions and formal rules of the game. And I would urge you to go and note down and go to these websites, because in all this talk about creating institutions, the first link takes you to a crossing in Vietnam, where there are no traffic lights, but the traffic flows very smoothly. And the second one takes you to Russia, where there are very efficient traffic lights, and it's a hellhole in terms of accidents. So we don't really know what to make of this thing about create formal rules as well. Similarly, I think there's a real uncertainty, and this is where I think thing comes in. What should we do? Do policymakers really have the freedom, given that so much of it is luck and unintended consequence, and inherently unknowable, or to use Donald Rumsfeld's phrase, the unknown unknowns, or the never knowables, as it were. And also, a lot of it is, of course, historically determined. A country has good institutions, but again, as Bill has written and as others have written, many of these institutions are historically determined. So it's not clear, what someone can do to acquire these good institutions. Okay, so my last slide is the following, is that now, where do we stand on the policy agenda? And remember, yet we're talking not about centralized planning from Washington, but there are ministers and elected officials and policymakers within governments who need to make choices. For example, in India, teachers don't show up to classrooms. I mean, it's very easy to say, let it be, they will automatically come up, the market will find its solution, but there are actual choices that governments have to make. Even in terms of entrepreneurship that Bill was speaking about, can the government create conditions for entrepreneurship? To give you a good example, is it always the case that you should have, completely free markets, or should it be the case that government should actually provide for rents to create the conditions for entrepreneurship? So if I have one takeaway at the end, is that it seems to be the case that successful developers, countries, have somehow had the capacity to figure out these things for themselves. So fatal conceit of the outsiders, fully agree. But within countries, there are still choices to be made, decisions to be taken, and what do we think about that? And I think here maybe the pendulum has swung too much in terms of saying, the market will do everything on its own. Maybe what distinguishes the successful developers is that they have effective public capacity, state capacity, to figure these things out for themselves. And how to get that state capacity seems to be a big, I would say, an agenda for further research and reflection. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to respond to any of that?
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Arvind. We'll give Bill just a chance to respond to a couple of those comments.
Okay, thanks, Arvind. I'm a big admirer of Arvind's research, and I appreciated very much his insights just now. I think they're basically. I just want to disagree with him on two things. First, he's giving all these statistics on how it's not the most reformist countries that have grown the most, and that actually the countries that have reformed the most have grown the least, or have done badly, and that's undeniably true. I totally agree with that. I've written papers on that. Other people have written papers on that. What is the lesson of this? I think the lesson is that you should not look for evidence of what works and what doesn't work in growth rates. In GDP growth rates over some relatively short period of time. And unfortunately, relatively short can even mean as long as 10 or 20 years. That we just cannot learn very much about what works and what doesn't work by focusing obsessively on growth rates as being the metric for success or failure. Because what do growth rates really capture? They capture lots of different things. For one thing, growth rates are heavily influenced by how bad things were before you started to have rapid growth. One very good way to have rapid growth is to, one interpretation of the China model for having rapid growth is first you put a psychopathic maniac in charge of the economy who kills tens of millions of people and completely terrorizes anyone from doing anything and destroys whatever hope there is of any success by anybody. Call him Chairman Mao just for purposes of illustration. And then thank God he dies and you get somewhat more sensible, pragmatic people take over and move away from a homicidal assault on the citizens of the country to sort of letting them operate in globalized free markets and take advantage of global free trade by themselves. That's a formula for rapid growth. So, any one of you, if you can achieve rapid growth in income by, giving up everything you have and becoming a homeless person for a year, you have a very low income for that year, and then return to what you were doing before and once again resume the business of becoming a successful, high-earning professional, and then you have very rapid growth of your income from the time that you were a homeless person to the time that you were a high-income professional. So growth really doesn't mean anything more than that. It just means things were really disastrous before, and now they're not so disastrous, they're better. So that kind of evidence tells us very little about what is the key to success or failure. I think the meaningful evidence is very much in levels. Those graphs that I showed you before between economic and political freedom and the very high correlation with the level of development. I think that is what vindicates the Hayekian prediction that out of freedom will emerge the successful meeting of the wants and needs that we can't even foresee or predict today of the population. And, how does China and India do on that scale? Well, not so good. China was at 1/10 of GDP before the new PPP revision. How much was China's income revised downward in the new PPP?
About 40%.
40%. So now China's at about 1/20th of U.S. per capita income. So is China a great success? No, not yet. We have to wait for quite a while before we call China a great success. India was at 1/20th, and how much is it? Where is India revised down? Also by 40%. So now India is something like 1/40th of U.S. per capita income. Is that a great success? No, not yet. We're going to have to wait for a long while before we see whether India is really a great success or not. It's levels that matters. I mean, both for the rationale that I gave you before, but also because levels is what matters for well-being. You don't. What meets your material needs is your level of income, not your growth of income. The second point I disagreed with Arvind is that the idea that there's the key to success is that the state has the capacity to make the wise choices, to figure out the wise choices for all of society. Now, certainly there's an element of truth in this, but I think it's much more chaotic than Arvind makes it out to be. I think Arvind's view is very much the conventional view of a lot of economists, so I certainly respect that view. But it's a view which I think engages in a little too much hero worship of policymakers at the top, and basically jumps to the conclusion that if anything good happens in the economy, it must be due to the credit of these heroic policymakers at the top that figured things out. And actually, we have no direct evidence of that. How do you actually prove that idea that the policymakers were such geniuses at the top? It seems instead to be what is known in social science as the halo effect, that whenever there's a success, you attribute it to the great leader at the top. And that's just jumping to an assumption. There's no evidence for that. It's like, when if a football team wins the Super Bowl, then all of a sudden the coach who yesterday was an idiot becomes a genius just because of one play in the last seconds by which the bumbling New York Giants suddenly surprised us after all these years and completely contrary to expectations when they disappointed their fans reliably for hundreds and hundreds of times. Somehow, in a game that was called the Super Bowl, they happened to somehow stumble into the end zone at the right moment and win the game. Suddenly, their idiotic coach is now called a great genius because they won the game. Well, that's pretty much what we do when we say, those Korean policymakers, they were such geniuses. They figured everything out. They made the... Well, how do we know that? How do we know it wasn't some really dynamic Korean entrepreneurs that found big hits, and that set the whole chain in motion by which the leaders who may have been kind of clueless at the beginning gradually accommodated the success of the private entrepreneurs. Now, I'm not saying that there is no role for the state whatsoever. I think it's a more chaotic role, that individual political operators, under certain political systems that reward politicians for doing things that are good for economic development in a sort of competitive way, that they do figure out opportunistic steps that enhance the prospects for economic development. And there I agree with Arvind that it's really insiders that do that, but it happens in a very chaotic way. It's not that there's one wise leader at the top. It's that there are individual entrepreneurs who figure out something will work, who by trial and error kind of stumble on things that make the economy work better. Who would have figured out that in China the town village enterprises would be a great vehicle for success? Nobody figured that out at the top or the bottom. It just happened, and then people went with it. That's kind of the model for successful reform. It's much more decentralized and chaotic than Arvind makes it out to be. And it, above all, happens best in the systems that are set up so as to be competitive, that the best political ideas win, which is, a system of political individual liberty, in which we are free to dissent, free to debate ideas, free to call ideas stupid, free to shoot ideas down, do the thing that Arvind said economists are the garbage collectors that collect the trash and collect all the bad ideas and dump them out in the trash and throw them away. Well, that happens best in a free society, where individuals have rights, where individuals can speak out freely, where there's freedom of the press, where there's some kind of democratic accountability of the leaders to the citizens. And I'm not, by the way, that This is one thing that bothers people a lot when you say, you know, democracy is part of the answer, is they say, well, there's all these problems with majority rule. I'm not saying it's just a matter of holding elections that are won by majority rule. That's not the panacea. There is no panacea like that. It's a very complex system of lots of elements of individual political freedom that include some mechanism for accountability to the citizens. But it is not so simple as just hold elections. It involves institutions of individual liberty that have grown up over many generations, and the best way to promote them is once again to come back to sort of convince people. You have to convince individuals within the society to value individual liberty and to be willing to see individual liberty protected. I think that's the deeper struggle that we face in development, is not so much these surface struggles as to what policy to choose next, but to convince as many individuals as possible of the case for individual liberty, and then the best ideas will tend to win over time. Thanks very much.
Do you want to say anything?
Just a couple of things.
Okay, quick, because I do want to take some questions from the audience. Thank you.
You know, just two quick reactions. First, you know, don't get me wrong. I would always favor a system with, you know, political decentralization and political freedoms over the alternative. The question was whether it automatically follows that, you know, those political freedoms is going to deliver development. That was the narrower question that I was addressing. But the point I want to make is that, you know, it's true that, you know, in the long run, what Bill is saying is absolutely right. I mean, lots of us have done research to show that in the long run, these things matter. But put yourself in the case, supposing you went to China in 1978, supposing the World Bank had gone to China in 1978, and God forbid, Bill, you would have had to, suppose you had gone with that team in 1978 to China, what they would have said is, you know, let's say decentralization, economic decentralization. And a whole laundry list of kind of reforms would have been put out. But the Chinese did something very different. And so far it seems to have succeeded. So the question is, you know, whether whether economic decentralization automatically translates into that is not at all obvious. And finally, I think there is no. I think, Bill, you're trying to create a false opposition between, you know, glorifying the heroes of the state incorrectly versus not giving sufficient thing to the private sector and the entrepreneurs who come up. And I don't think it's an opposition at all. I think both are important, but I don't think we should forget that, you know, there are things that states need to do to create the conditions even for private entrepreneurship to flourish. So it can't just be a kind of Beatles like "Let It Be," you know.
Which comes first?
That needs to be.
How do you know?
Figured out.
How do you know which comes first?
That's countries figure that out for themselves.
Does the state come first, or does the private entrepreneur come first?
I mean, I would say that there's no question. I mean, if you were in a, you know, look at Iraq where you don't have a state, we're in a Hobbesian state, you know, you can't have entrepreneurship in Hobbesian states.
In the extreme, no, but suppose you have a mediocre state and then you have a really dynamic, successful entrepreneur that creates the demand for a much more capable state. So I think it goes both ways, right?
Okay, I want to take some questions from the audience. Raise your hand, wait for the microphone, and then identify yourself and your affiliation, please. We'll take a question in the back, sitting there, please. Yeah.
Okay. I'm Lena Johansson. I'm the journalism fellow at CI right now. Without getting into the discussion of polycentric versus government-run legal systems, the one thing none of you touched upon was the importance of contractual rights and how that creates the trust needed to create a market and to start interactions. And could we get some more thoughts on that, because none of you really touched it?
Talking about intellectual property rights?
No, not intellectual, contractual rights.
Contractual rights.
Yeah, the fact that or protection of contracts, that you need to have kind of a protection of contracts to establish the trust necessary to have a functioning market.
Okay, I'd like to take a couple of questions at a time, and then, because we're running a little bit behind. Let's take one there, and then the other one right there.
Hi. Kevin Finner at the National Academy of Sciences. Solow is very popular in our community as well, largely because of his thoughts on the role of technology in economic growth One of the preconditions for having technology and using it well is having an education system that provides both people who can be innovators at the top end and workers who can be successful in producing the technology. I wonder what you think about the sort of policy or state role in education, and also what it means to have freedom in an educational system.
Okay, right there. The next question.
Yeah, two quick questions for Bill, but also Arvind, if he has a comment. On the
Could you identify yourself, please?
Yeah, Peter Whitney with Duke University. The case of the Korean entrepreneurs, and I've done a lot of work in Korea. Isn't it fair to say that Park Chung-hee, not that he's a hero, he had a lot of flaws, did help create a system where these big hits could take place? And then the other question is, I know we looked at the manufacturing exports of your top 3 manufacturers, but I think the numbers really show that disguises what's really going on, which is that 3/4 of trade is intra-industry trade. The Ford Escort that's made out of 37 or 42 parts from all different countries. So I just want to be interested in your comments on those things.
Okay. Contractual rights. Well, there are obviously we all agree that those are necessary to make markets work. That contracts have to be honored. Well, just to continue in the contrarian vein that I seem to have gotten stuck in today, there's a very important way in which those emerge from the bottom up, and they don't emerge just by the state passing a law that says everybody shall honor thou shalt honor thy contracts from now on. That's not really how they emerge. There's a lot of it would be incredibly costly for the state to enforce all the contracts that make our economy and even our regular social lives function. The kind of trust between us that we trust each other to keep certain obligations and agreements. A lot of that emerges from the bottom up, and there's been a lot of economic research about how self-enforcing networks can sort of enforce their own contracts through reputational mechanisms. That if you cheat, that you get expelled from the network and you forever lose opportunity to do business with the network. So this, again, I think we've excessively gotten stuck in this top-down mindset where the state has to put everything in place to make development possible, and then development happens. I don't think that's the way it happens at all. I think a lot of it is happening from the creativity from the bottom up of individuals that agree on, and Hayek was very big on this. Well, good morning. I have to confess I'm a little flustered in giving this talk because I was up late last night reading Hayek, trying to really nail down once and for all what is Hayek's secret to development, because I thought Hayek is, more than anyone, would be the economist who really finally gave us this answer to the question that we've been seeking all this time for so many years, for 25 years of my career and for all the time of you. It's actually not several decades, Ian. It's just 25 years. So I was sort of up late last night reading Hayek. Then I woke up early this morning, read some more Hayek. I was kind of combing through Hayek, volume after volume, desperately trying to extract every last ounce of wisdom from Hayek as to what is the secret to economic development. And I finally nailed it at about 11:15 this morning. And I put it in the presentation, put it in the PowerPoint slides, immediately emailed them to Ian, ran out to my car and started speeding towards the Cato Institute to give this talk. In fact, a little too enthusiastically speeding, because what I'm telling you is true. I was actually pulled over for speeding.
The aid discussion, it seems to me, is a great distraction away from the real determinants of growth. And it is a reflection also of the constructivist mentality that I think still holds sway in much of development economics, whereby Washington, the World Bank, or government programs are reflexively called to solve the big problems of underdevelopment. An extreme manifestation of that mentality is the current political campaign to massively increase foreign aid to poor countries in order to pull them from their so-called poverty traps. Old, discredited ideas are being brought up, ideas that have very little support, actually, among development practitioners, and canvassed in today's political capitals. There is another view, however, one that sees decentralized decision-making in the market and in politics, that views that as a superior path. More and more scholars are discovering the insights of Nobel laureate Friedrich Hayek, one of the 20th century's greatest social thinkers, as they apply to developing countries. Insights on dispersed knowledge, on subjective preferences, on the discovery process, the role of information, and so on, all make the case against planning and in favor of individual liberty and a great deal of humility. That's why I'm very pleased to have with us today. Welcome to the Cato Institute. Before we begin, let me ask all of you to please turn off your cell phones if you have them, since that interferes with our sound system here. My name is Ian Vásquez. I direct our Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity. Economic history is full of examples of successes, of people, of innovations and inventions of entire countries. The explanations of economic success are about as varied as the examples. Now, development economics, as a subfield of economics, which was born in the post-war period, has gone through a number of fads over the decades, and for a long time ignored the lessons of developed countries. Those fads have included an emphasis on infrastructure, on industrialization, on poverty reduction, a focus on agriculture, state-led development, lending conditioned on market reforms, the so-called Washington Consensus, and so on. Development economics has matured over the years, and I would say that most practitioners now do accept a central role for the market and reject the more naive faith in predatory governments that characterized the field in earlier years. But in Washington, it's difficult to talk about economic development without the discussion quickly devolving into a discussion about foreign aid. And that's a shame, because we know that there are a number of things, not foreign aid, which are the real determinants of economic progress.
Away here. And the officer kind of waited in his car for a while, presumably to check out if I was driving a stolen vehicle that was registered to Al-Qaeda. And then he came up to my window. He said, "You know, why are you going so fast? I could arrest you right here and now." And that really shook me up. And I said, "Well, I'm sorry. I'm kind of rushing because I have to give a talk at the Cato Institute at 12 o'clock. And he said, "Oh, okay, go ahead." And he let me go. So Ian, you may not have realized this, but you have friends in the U.S. Park Police that realize the central role of the Cato Institute in our society. So let's go. Let's find out, what is Hayek's secret to development? Well, we badly need a secret because there's been this developing consensus in the new millennium that we don't know how to achieve development or how to achieve economic growth. And normally I'm a very humble guy and don't celebrate my own accomplishments, but I'm kind of proud of the fact that back in 2001 I wrote a column for the Financial Times called "The Failure of Development." It actually came out on July 4th, 2001, when I was still employed by the World Bank, and the World Bank was so swayed by my arguments at that time that they promoted
Bill Easterly, who's one of the country's leading development economists, somebody who has discovered over the past several decades in his career how useful some of Hayek's thinking can be in thinking about economic development. Bill Easterly is a professor of economics at New York University, and he also works at the Africa House, which is part of New York University. He is the co-director of New York University's Development Research Institute. He's also a non-resident fellow at the Center for Global Development here in Washington, and a visiting fellow currently at the Brookings Institution. He is the author of countless academic articles and several books. One of them is The White Man's Burden. Another one is The Elusive Quest for Growth. Believe it or not, I've known Bill the early 1990s when he worked at the World Bank. And so it's my pleasure to welcome him on his journey from the World Bank to the F.A. Hayek Auditorium today. Please help me welcome Bill Easterly.